Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, today's episode will be kind of important, I think, for three reasons. One is that we'll be returning to this amazing and so deeply subversive dialogue, Plato's great erotic work, The Symposium. You might remember that we spent quite a few episodes, actually, on Plato's Symposium earlier in this series, before taking a bit of a side trip in order to be able to understand some of its implications or ramifications in ways that might not be that plain to us if the Symposium were the only Plato we had read. And now that we've done that, we're ready to dive back into the Symposium and rejoin our tipsy Athenian friends. And yes, I think it's fair to assume they're tipsy, as the dialogue mentions actually that they're still drinking despite their hangovers from the previous night, and though they've pledged not to drink to the kind of extreme states that you'd normally have at an ancient Greek symposium. Despite all that, this pledge ultimately gets broken toward the end of the dialogue. So the second reason why I think this episode is kind of pivotal is that we're turning, as I think I mentioned recently, from a kind of theoretical discussion of love and desire, a discussion of the essence of eros and its object, which, as we've seen, isn't actually an object, to the question of how it's actually realized in us, how we can come to actually live out our best love lives. And that will really be the focus of the rest of this series. And finally, the third reason, which is actually kind of connected to the second, really, is that, as I mentioned last time, today we might start to see our assumptions about Plato kind of destabilized a bit if we bring to Plato this kind of typically modern notion voiced, as we saw by Heidegger, for example, as being concerned ultimately with what you could call objective truth, with thinking correctly, as understanding truth to be the correspondence of our thinking with the objective world, or to put it in terms favored by Ian McGilchrist, with operating mostly in the left hemisphere of the brain. And just by the way, this book and even the concept of brain lateralization have come under criticism by neuroscientists. This book, The Master and His Emissary. I mean, in fact, even the concept of brain region specialization, I don't think is really that cut and dried, as brain function seems to remain largely mysterious to us, actually. And the brain seems to exhibit, in some ways, a startling amount of despecialization by region, or as some neuroscientists argue, the brain actually processes information in a highly distributed way, which is why some patients who have lost a part of their brain are sometimes able to recover in surprising ways. All of which, of course, is a bit of a digression. But anyway, so yes, if we bring to Plato this kind of expectation, we'll find that the prophetess Diotima, who is really at the core of this whole dialogue, and thereby really also at the core of Plato's doctrine of love and desire, really, we'll see her really kind of throwing us for a loop today by an idea she puts forth. And we might add, we might even be thrown for a loop even by the bare fact that the highest form of wisdom is shown here as coming from a prophetess, not to mention these repeated suggestions of the centrality here of altered states of consciousness, the centrality, I mean, of wine and intoxication to the dialogue, the heavy use of sexual and religious language, sometimes in the same breath. So here's the thing. If we come to Platonism seeing it as basically, you might say, just a function of the left brain, you might expect the quest of human desire, the quest for the good, because we've just heard Diotima say that desire is for nothing other than the good, You might expect that to be a quest of the mind only, an attempt to fully understand the good as we understand any other object of thought. And actually, that is what we see to some extent with this famous ladder of love image that we'll come to a bit later in the dialogue. We'll see a dialectical process, a movement of thought. But the crucial thing is, we'll see not only this, we see alongside of it a completely different way of attaining the good, or perhaps better put, a completely different way of conceptualizing or articulating how it is that the psyche attains or enjoys the good. And this way is going to be a stumbling block for us, I think, as long as we conceive of the human quest as an undertaking solely of the mind. I'll get to that in a minute, but I'm also thinking we've been away from the symposium so long that perhaps we could benefit from a brief recap before we dive back into it. So if we had one of those previously on Platonic Soul type recaps that you see on TV, it would run something like this maybe. We might show this decision on the part of these drinking party buddies to spend the evening taking turns praising Eros, and then we might give samples of their speeches, which all had this striking beauty and emotional power, but also in a way failed to maybe failed to really satisfy us, or failed to solve this implicit problem of reconciling basically reason and passion. And then we might show Socrates introducing the character of Diotima, and we might show her talking about how Eros is not a god, nor purely good, as Agathon had argued, but rather an intermediary being, a daimon, and the child of poverty and resource, or is sometimes translated to yield a more neat pair of opposites, poverty and plenty. And then, of course, absolutely critical to our recap would be a clip of Diotima saying, all human desire is really just Eros in the wider sense of the term, and that Eros in this wider sense is for nothing but the good, so that humans desire nothing but the good. And then we might skip to the scene in the Republic, in which Plato describes the good as the principle of everything. Flash forward several hundred years to Plotinus, who equates the good with the absolute unity of objective and subjective being. And then returning back to Plato with a few scenes from the Phaedrus, in which it's made clear that we all have a kind of unconscious knowledge or awareness or memory of the one and good. And then we also have an unconscious desire to raise this awareness, to this knowledge, to consciousness. So this would take us to where we left off. And it would also leave us with the question, which becomes, how do we satisfy our desire exactly? How do we raise our buried memory of the good, the absolute unity of everything, to consciousness? You could put this in sort of subjective terms, I guess, as how do we bring this ecstatic state, which is in some way buried in our unconscious, yet is something alongside which we live our mundane lives, an ecstatic state or a kind of wordless knowledge. In some ways, it's already our companion in life, isn't it? Through these flow states and all these myriad other altered states of consciousness that are actually in some way part of daily life. And I was thinking, I don't think we conventionally think of it this way, but I think humor in a way is also an altered state of consciousness. That moment, there's a kind of ecstatic moment that occurs in the mind where it's as though everything is in a kind of glorious unity that prompts us to laugh. Anyway, all these altered states of consciousness, perhaps you could call it a kind of joy of life that's like a companion who accompanies us without our seeming to even realize its presence. How do we come to realize it then? How do we come to live it more fully out? And so when we land back in the symposium, picking up where we left off, we'll see this is exactly the question Diotima puts to Socrates. She's explained to him that all that lovers, and by lovers, she means, of course, lovers in that wide sense, human beings, all that lovers love is nothing but the good itself. So she now asks Socrates how it is that people generally tend to realize their eros. And out of that discussion will emerge a theory of how best this can actually be done. And she says, Socrates tells us, this then is the object of love, she said. Now, how do lovers pursue it? We'd rightly say that when they are in love, they do something with eagerness and zeal. But what is it precisely that they do? Can you say? Socrates, it turns out, can't say, which is kind of striking, really, because we can get used to this idea of the Socrates of Plato's dialogues as being a bit like the Odysseus of Homer, never at a loss. And so, in fact, he often gives this impression of not only not ever being at a loss, but having some kind of knowledge in reserve that he doesn't seem to want to fully disclose, but he just sort of gives hints of. Anyway, so Diotima proceeds to answer the question for him, and she says, it is giving birth in beauty, whether in body or in soul. Now, there's a peculiarity of ancient Greek here that makes this passage impossible to render into English in a way that's really perfectly satisfying. In this sentence and similar ones that follow in this passage of the Symposium, she uses two verbs to convey the idea of reproduction, tikto and geneo, but to convey it not in a gender-specific way. In English, we're used to these gender-specific terms. Females give birth and males beget. We don't really have a word that works for both sexes in English. Not that I can think of. We could say engender, but we use that in a broader sense as sort of giving rise to something. But these gender-specific terms don't really convey the universality that Diotima is trying to get across here. So it's always a bit of a problem for translators. But the other really striking thing, of course, is that Diotima has chosen to put it this way at all. She immediately tries to explain what she means to Socrates by this image of giving birth, of begetting in the beautiful. But her wondrous elaboration, I think, will raise more questions for most of us than it answers. And I quote here the translation of C.D.C. Reeve, which tends to be sort of my default translation of these erotic works of Plato. She says, all of us are pregnant, Socrates, both in body and in soul. And now, obviously, no man and not even all women are pregnant, even physically. And so it becomes kind of clear here that she's speaking of physical pregnancy as though to suggest more broadly sort of reproductive potency generally, whether male or female. So all of us are pregnant, Socrates. We all have a reproductive potency, both in body and in soul. And as soon as we come to a certain age, we naturally desire to give birth. Or actually, the word is that tiktain, that is engender. Now, no one can possibly give birth in anything ugly, only in something beautiful. That's because when a man and woman come together in order to give birth, this is a godly affair. Pregnancy, reproduction, this is an immortal thing for a mortal animal to do, and it cannot occur in anything that is out of harmony, i.e., in which the one in the many, you could say, is not manifest, cannot occur in anything that is out of harmony, but ugliness is out of harmony with all that is godly. Beauty, however, is in harmony with the divine. Therefore, the goddess who presides at childbirth, she's called Moira or Elithuia, is really beauty. That's why, whenever pregnant animals or persons draw near to beauty, they become gentle and joyfully disposed, and give birth and reproduce. But near ugliness, they frown and draw back in pain. They turn away and shrink back and do not reproduce. And because they hold on to what they carry inside them, the labor is painful. And also, I think we need to understand for this passage to make sense, not just painful, but delayed. This is the source of the great excitement about beauty that comes to anyone who is pregnant, who has this reproductive potency and already teeming with life. Beauty releases them from their great pain. You see, Socrates, she said, what Eros wants is not beauty as you think it is. Well, what is it then? He asks. And she replies, reproduction and birth in beauty. What Eros wants is not beauty as you think it is. What could she mean by this? I think it's hard not to think here, and I think this will become apparent as we proceed through this dialogue, that the prophetess is critical here of this idea that the satisfaction of human desire is simply a matter of knowing the good as we would know any object, that it's simply an act of abstraction. And why would she say that? I think the answer to that question is enormous for our understanding of Platonic love, actually. And I'll be starting to answer it, trying to answer it next time. I hope you can join me then. And until then, be well, and thanks for watching.